This is Human Anatomy and Physiology 1 and the first part of Chapter 6 on bones and skeletal tissue from the Human Anatomy and Physiology textbook by Marieb, published by Pierce and Benjamin Cummings. So we start out our discussion just looking at three types of cartilage, because cartilage is associated with the skeleton oftentimes, and so we'll take a look at how that connection occurs. Cartilage is a incompressible but flexible tissue made up of collagen and an extracellular matrix rich in chondroitin sulfate proteoglycans, which gives it a incompressible structure relative to, say, connective tissue proper, and is surrounded by a connective tissue jacket, the perichondrium. Hyaline cartilage is the finest of the cartilage, and when I say fine, I mean the collagen fibers, the extracellular matrix, are the finest of the three cartilages. And in fact, in the light microscope, you don't see them, you just see an amorphous sea of gray or pink, depending on the staining. And then lacuna, hollow spaces where the chondrocytes or cartilage cells live. We'll find hyaline cartilage on the surface of bones where joints form. The freely movable types of joints especially have articular cartilage on the surface, and then with a little bit of lubricant in there can move freely without friction. Also, hyaline cartilage forms the nasal cartilages, the cartilages of the rib cage. The ribs are attached to the sternum with a bar of cartilage, the costal cartilages. The larynx is a box of cartilage. We'll encounter that in another chapter in detail. Elastic cartilage has a lot of elastin protein as opposed to mainly collagen protein. Otherwise, it's similar in construction to hyaline cartilage. And we find elastic cartilage in the pinna of the ear and in the epiglottis, the valve that closes down over your larynx when you swallow, so stuff doesn't go down the wrong way, quote unquote. Fibrocartilage is the heaviest, most coarse kind of cartilage, tough building material indeed, but yet flexible and so forth. And so fibrocartilage fibers are very coarse and analogous to, say, maybe dense, irregular connective tissue compared to the fine collagen fibers in areolar tissue. All right, so fibrocartilage is very tough. It forms the intervertebral discs between each of your vertebral bones. Allows you to move your spine around and have some flexibility, but yet be very tough material. We'll see that the vertebrae have another kind of joint that connects the two vertebral bones or defines their movement to some degree as well, but the fibrocartilage forms the discs. In your knee, there's a shock-absorbing pad, or a pair of them in each knee, called the menisci. So the meniscus is made of fibrocartilage. Remember, cartilage has no blood vessels of its own, and it's not particularly regenerative. And so a torn meniscus in the knee is a bit of a problem sometimes, because what we end up is with a compromised joint from then on. Here's the Cartilage Man. It shows the location of the three kinds of cartilage. They've drawn hyaline cartilage in blue and elastic cartilage in green here, and then the epiglottis over here in this little expanded diagram, and then fibrocartilage in red to help you remember where to find those different types of cartilages. I'm going to skip right over this slide and not emphasize cartilage anymore. This is a chapter about bone tissue, so let's go right for it. What's the purpose of bones? Bones support the body, support the organs, and so there's a fence, essentially, for example, of bone around the organs of the thorax. The heart and the lungs and the kidneys are walled off from the outside world by this nice fence of bone to protect it and support it. The organs need to be held up and so forth. The skeleton, I threw in this cartoon by Gary Larson. I want to make sure I gave credit to Gary Larson for this cartoon, which a cartoonist that was very influential during the formative years of my life. So I couldn't resist showing you where we get boneless chicken from. If you don't have a skeleton, you have this kind of amorphous arrangement of your body, perhaps. He had a predisposition for a lot of biology-related humor. So anyway, we have support, protection of those organs, as I mentioned, movement. Muscles are attach the skeleton in such a way that they operate the skeleton like a series of levers so that we can move around and manipulate things in our environment. The skeleton stores calcium ions. We need to have calcium as a signaling ion for all kinds of really, really important signaling processes in cells throughout your body. Muscle cells, neurons depend on it for contraction and exocytosis of neurotransmitter, for example. So we have this reservoir of calcium and phosphate in the extracellular matrix of bone, as we'll see. The red bone marrow, where all the blood cells come from, resides in some bone called spongy bone, as we'll see later on also. There's a little bit of fat. The bones of your appendages, your arms and legs, the larger bones, the long bones, are hollow and they're filled with fats. There's a little bit of adipose tissue there. Hormone production. Bones, we're finding more and more about hormones produced by bones and by adipose tissue. And so there's some function of osteocalcin, this relatively recently identified and understood hormone from bone. So in order to make our job of learning about the skeleton easier, we're going to classify the bones in a couple different ways. The first way we're going to do it is to divide the bones of the skeleton into two groups. The axial skeleton forms the long axis of the body, as written here. It includes the skull, the spinal column, and the rib cage. And then onto that central unit we attach the appendages, the arms and legs. So the appendicular skeleton includes all the bones of your limbs, as well as the girdles that attach. The limbs have to be attached onto the axial skeleton, and the pelvis and the pectoral girdles are going to do that for us. So here's a nice cartoon showing in green the axial skeleton, and then in tan the appendicular skeleton. You should definitely know the names of each one of these major bones of the skeleton. So make sure, if you haven't ever had this opportunity to learn those bones in the past, I want you to take to this diagram and make it your own. Cover up those terms and practice until you can just name every single one of those bones reflexively. That'll help you a great deal as we go through. Interestingly, you can see the appendages, or the girdles I was talking about. Here's the scapula and the clavicle. Those are form the pectoral girdle that attach your arm. Your humerus bone of your arm attaches onto the pectoral girdle here on the scapula. And here's the pelvic girdle here that attaches your legs on by way of the femurs. Oh, Cartilage Man is back. Don't know why. I gotta fix that. Another way we're going to classify bones is kind of by shape. And so we're going to make 4 piles of all the bones in the skeleton. The long bones are the bones of your appendages again. So these long, skinny bones with knobby ends are called long bones. And so the humerus, the radius and ulna, and the digits, the metacarpals and carpals of your hand, the femur and tibia and fibula, as well as the metatarsals and phalanges of your feet are long bones, not the ankles and wrists. The ankles and wrists are comprised of short bones, like little cubes of bone that make up those structures to give a lot of sort of versatility of movement of those extremities. So we've got long bones, we've got short bones. Flat bone is what constructs your sternum. So your breastbone or sternum is made of flat bones. The bones of your skull are flat bones. So it's important to point out that flat bone doesn't just mean flat as in planar. It's actually a bone construction type, and it arises by a certain process during development. So think of flat bones not so much as, you can see how rounded the cranium is here, but in fact the type of bone there is flat bone. All right, and finally irregular bones. They have a little catch-all spot to put bones that are kind of bizarre in shape and don't fit into these other categories. Okay, let's look at the structure of bones. Osseous is a term that means, it's an adjective that means of bone. So osseous tissue is bone tissue. There's all the bones in your body are made up of essentially different combinations of 2 types of bones anatomically. There's compact bone, which is very dense and kind of uniform. It's also called lamellar bone. And as we'll see, lamella are layers, and there's part of the construction of compact bone that involves some layering. And spongy bone. Spongy bone this is a perfect operational name. It looks like a sponge, only the little parts that are not hollow are actually bone, so it's fairly stiff, even though it's called spongy bone. It's also called trabecular bone because the little bars that form all the bony parts of spongy bone are called trabecula. That's kind of an anatomical term that we'll encounter elsewhere when we have some kind of just structures invading into some space within an organ of the body, for example. Another name for trabecular bone is cancellous bone, right? Because there's some hollow areas where there isn't any bone as opposed to compact bone, which is very uniform and dense. Okay, so here's a little cutaway of the femur, the head of the femur that inserts into your pelvis to form this nice little ball and socket joint. And here is some spongy bone in the head of this femur, and you can see how kind of open it is, and all the little trabecula, all these like bony elements in here are called trabecula. The shaft of a long bone is made up of compact bone. Look how uniform and dense that is. So it's extremely strong stuff, right? Because the shaft of a long bone is very skinny, and yet it's extremely strong. The surface of the head of the bone, though, is also covered by a layer of compact bone, and then there's also, as we'll see later, some cartilage on here. We said there's some articular cartilage, hyaline cartilage on the ends of bones where the joints are going to form. Here's a cutaway of some flat bone. And flat bone is like a sandwich of compact bone plates on the outside and inside, and then some spongy bone in between. The spongy bone of flat bones has this wonderful name. It's called diploa. And maybe that term will pop up in the near future, and I'll point it out to you. Oh, here we can see it in fine print. It's a wonderful term that comes from another language, but we retained it because it was the term used to describe the structure when it was designated by the discoverer or the person credited with that discovery. So diploa is the spongy bone in there. Here's a little cartoon of a long bone, and the long bone, again, has different parts to it that have distinct differences. The shaft of a long bone is made up of compact bone, extremely strong. That's called the diaphysis. So from now on, we're going to introduce some technical terms, and as always, I want you to eschew the use of the familiar terms from now on. Always refer to the skinny part of a long bone as its diaphysis. The heads of long bones are called epiphyses. That's not a strange word, epiphyses. So we have the diaphysis, the epiphysis, and the epiphysis is filled with spongy bone or cancellous bone, and the surface of the head of this bone is going to form a joint. These knobby ends are enlarged in order to create a more stable joint structure, because joints are inherently much, much weaker than the bones themselves. So this knobby area is like a tip-off that we're going to have a joint there. There's some hyaline cartilage, some articular cartilage there on the end of the bone. The articular cartilage gives way to a different kind of tissue on the surface of the rest of this bone. There's a connective tissue covering called the periosteum, and we'll see that in a little bit more close-up view in a second. Long bones in adults are typically hollow. The larger long bones are hollow. They have what's called a hollow medullary cavity. A commonly used anatomical term for the inner part of an organ or a structure is the medulla, and surrounded by an outer cortex. So the medullary cavity is hollow, and in that medullary cavity is some yellow bone marrow. It's fat, it's adipose tissue. And then here in the spongy bone, we would find red bone marrow. All the cells of a blood cell making factory. All the red blood cells and white blood cells come from red bone marrow. Bone is a highly vascular tissue. You'll see lots of drawings of blood vessels in here, so that'll remind us of that fact. Here's a cutaway of part of a bone that shows it's near the probably part of the epiphysis because we can see some hyaline cartilage, some articular cartilage on the surface. We can see some compact bone again on the surface, and then we see some spongy bone deep to that. And there's a network of blood vessels and lots of stem cells and progenitor cells that give rise to all the blood cells here in the red bone marrow. Here in this portion of a long bone, the diaphysis of a long bone, we can get a little bit of a preview of how a compact bone is constructed. You see all these circles represent cross sections through long stick-like cylinders that form the compact bone, and we'll get a look at those in a minute. We can see the adipose tissue in here. So the outside of this bone, wherever there isn't articular cartilage, there's the periosteum. It's essentially dense, irregular connective tissue proper. And so it's very heavy-duty collagen fibers, good tough jacket on the surface of the bone, and it's woven down onto the bone tissue by Sharpey's fibers. S-H-A-R-P-E-Y, Sharpey's fibers, and blood vessels will penetrate through the periosteum and through the compact and into the compact bone and provide a lot of, you can see a blood vessel here running up and down the length of one of these structures. But on the inside surface of the bone, there's also a connective tissue lining, a very delicate connective tissue lining of collagen fibers called the endosteum. And also all over the surface of trabecular bone is the endosteum and all over the bone surface. Again, red bone marrow is the factory, the source of blood cells, and it's found wherever there's spongy bone, essentially, cancellous bone, the diploid flat bones, the epiphyses of long bones. We find red bone marrow in there. In the yellow bone marrow is just adipose, found in the medullary cavity of long bones in adults. Incidentally, in infants and in the developing fetus, there would be red bone marrow in there in the long bones in the medulla, but during in adulthood we have remodeled that a bit. The next section is a series of terms used to describe what we call bone markings. The shape features of bones, right? Bones have all kinds of unusual shapes and unique shapes each bone has. Those are called bone markings, and we have some terms used, some of which are very unique terms for individual instances, but some of them are generalizable terms that we use to describe bone markings. If you're someone who grew up with an education that kind of leaned in towards agriculture or agrarian economy, you would know that the word tuber refers to fleshy, starchy roots of certain plants that are edible. And so someone who was coining these terms, when they looked at a large rounded projection, that just means something sticking up from the bone, thought of a tuber, thought of a carrot or a potato or something. I don't know if potatoes are tubers or not. A tuberosity. A smaller rounded projection, a tubercle, because it has that tuber in there, that fleshy, bulbous looking thing to them. A crest and a line represent sort of ridges of bone on the surface. Maybe we'll find some ridges sticking out of, say, on the part of the femur. The trochanters of the femur are just some very unusually shaped knobs. There's a greater and lesser trochanter on the femur. When you see a lot of these projections, what they are is places where we've increased the surface area of the bone and roughened it a bit to allow for a better attachment of tendons so that muscles can get a firm grip on the skeleton in order to lever it around as we desire. Speaking of which, epicondyles. What's an epicondyle? We better go ahead and look at what a condyle is. A condyle is a joint surface. So, right, we have bones that are structural and supportive and protective, but sometimes we have to form a joint so we can have movement, and a condyle is the surface of a bone where a joint will form. It's going to have that articular cartilage on there. And around the joint, there's usually some sort of bony projections or enlargements, and that's a place to attach some tendons, and muscles tend to be stretched across the joint from one bone to the other, attached by way of tendons. When the muscle contracts, it'll move those bones relative to that joint. So epicondyles, epi just means around or near, so we have epicondyles near the condyle of this knee joint here, part of the knee joint of the femur there. Okay, what else? Um, let's go to the next table and look at a couple of them. The head of a bone is going to be the epiphysis of a long bone, or sometimes the ribs also have heads. But so one of the epiphyses of a long bone might be named the head of the bone, as we'll see later. Facets are smooth, usually flat or slightly concave surfaces on bones where, again, a joint formed. Some hyaline cartilage was there and a joint was there. For example, if you look at the vertebral bones, there's a smooth, very smooth indentation where a joint formed with the ribs on the thoracic vertebra. They're called facets. There's facets on the vertebra where they form joints with the, or on the ribs where they form joints with the vertebra. So that's just a very smooth, flat, slightly rounded structure on the surface of a bone. Grooves, no big deal. Fissure. A fissure is like a crack. Not a crack as in broken, but a space. If you look into the orbits, now these drawings are very small, not very defined drawings, but they're just to call attention to some of these terms, and we'll come back and see these things in much more relief when we look in the lab at the individual bones and bone markings. But if you look back into the orbit carefully, you can see some sort of openings here in the back between the bones, and those are called fissures. A foramen is a round or oval passageway where, for example, a blood vessel penetrates through a bone to get into another compartment of the body. For example, the brain is ensconced in the cranium. The cranium is just a box of bones around the brain, but we need lots of blood vessels to feed all that neural tissue. We need connections to the outside, so we need to connect the brain to the rest of the body by nerves, and all those blood vessels and nerves need to pass through the bones of the cranium, so there's lots of foramina, or an individual foramen is a passageway in those bones for those organs to go through. There's an example of a deeper passageway, more like a canal. If you look on the lateral surface of your cranium, the familiar auditory canal or meatus, where your sound waves enter into your ears. That's called a meatus. A sinus is a hollow space within a bone, and typically when we talk about sinuses, we're talking about bones of the skull, the cranial bones, and they have some hollow spaces that are lined by a mucous membrane. And they're actually continuous with the nasal cavity. And there are several sinuses, as we'll see, and they actually act like resonating chambers, much like the body of an acoustic guitar sort of amplifies and projects the sound made by the strings. The sinuses help define what our voice sounds like as the sound waves resonate in those structures. And finally, a fossa. A fossa is a sort of a curved concave region, indentation or basin-like depression, as your authors have pointed out, in a bone. So for example, if you look at the side of the cranium, you see this indentation here, right? When you look at the cranium, we don't see that because it's flat, it's chock full of some muscle that's in there, but if you take away that muscle, you'll see this fossa, the temporal fossa, in the lateral aspect of the cranium. And there's a fossa, for example, in the iliac bone of your pelvis, nice curved concave area. All right, enough about bone markings. We'll treat the bone markings in more detail in the lab. How about the cells of bones? There's some cells we talked about. Connective tissue proper has fibroblasts. Reticular tissue has reticulocytes. Chondrocytes are in cartilage. Well, bone's got a kind of a litany of cells, and we should look at least 3 of these cells and get familiar with their functions. So first of all, there's some stem cells. Anytime you have a compartment of the body where cells are constantly being renewed or regenerated, there's going to be some immortal stem cells in there that are the source of those cells. And stem cells, as we talked about before, are these slow dividing, asymmetrically dividing cells, immortal cells that will give rise to daughter cells that will then typically divide or undergo mitosis rapidly many times to produce a population of progeny, whether blood cells or epithelial cells. So there's progenitor cells, osteogenic cells in there, cells that can make bone. That's another way to think of osteogenic, means being able to make bone. Osteoblasts are cells that can make bone. They're like the baby cells of the family. They're like most like an embryonic cell. They can make bone matrix from scratch. If you break a bone and you need to plaster in some brand new bone tissue, osteoblasts are your candidates for that. Osteocytes are also osteogenic. They live in lacuna, much like chondrocytes in cartilage. They need a hollow place to live in this extremely dense extracellular matrix. And the osteocytes are the maintenance guys. They stay in the lacuna and they're constantly replacing the extracellular matrix of your bones so that they stay resilient. Bone lining cells, we won't go too much into that, but I will say osteoclasts are very important. Osteoclasts, along with osteoblasts, live under the periosteum, and they're cells that can break down the extracellular matrix of bone. So, osteogenic progenitors, osteoprogenitor cells can give rise to osteoblasts, as well as osteocytes, the more mature maintenance osteogenic cell, and then finally osteoclasts come from white blood cell lineage, and they are cells that can dissolve the extracellular matrix of bone. We'll see why we would be interested in doing that later on. So let's talk about compact bone a little bit more. How is it constructed? What's the anatomy of compact bone? Well, it's called lamellar bone because of these osteons. The individual structural unit of compact bone is called the osteon. And let's get a picture of an osteon so that we can see what it looks like. It'll be a lot easier to kind of explain it. I'm going to come back to that picture. Here's the diaphysis, part of the diaphysis of the long bone. And it's made up of a whole bunch of stick-like osteons packaged together to form this enormously strong structure. There are some fables about the enormous strength of a bundle of sticks as compared to the individual sticks. And if you don't know what I mean, look up fables. Fables are wonderful tales used to impart wisdom from generation to generation. Historically, there's some real cool ones. But anyway, osteons are these long cylindrical structures that make up compact bone. So each osteon is made up of a bunch of concentric cylinders of bone tissue, and that's why it's called lamellar bone or layered bone. And here's part of an osteon. You can see the various layers that are built up upon one another. And in the middle of each osteon, in the center, is a long canal running its length called the central canal or haversion canal. It's a funny word. It's like the word aversion. If you have an aversion to something you don't like it, haversion with an H. An osteon is also called a haversion system, and the central canal is also called a haversion canal. Anyway, there's some blood vessels and nerves in there. There's a very vascular tissue, very blood vessel rich. Blood vessels penetrate through from the outside, through the periosteum, through the osteon, and right into this central canal, and then another horizontal passageway would carry blood vessels from osteon to osteon. So the connecting passageways or the entering passageways are called perforating canals. So we got a pack of sticks there to make up this compact bone, and then to fill in the gaps in between, there are some layers of compact bone in there called interstitial lamella, interstitial layers. Interstitial just means the space between, right? So if we just put a bunch of cylinders next to each other, we'd have some spaces in between them. We're going to fill that right in with interstitial lamella to really tidy this thing up and make it stiff and dense. And then on the outside of the diaphysis here, we have some layers of bone that run the entire circumference of this diaphysis, and they're called circumferential lamella. Makes it smooth on the surface. So that's the construction of compact bone in the diaphysis of this long bone. Each osteon is made even stronger by the arrangement of the collagen fibers. So here we just see a simple cartoon drawing of the lamella, and the collagen fibers are arranged kind of in spiral by the cells as they make this tissue, and each layer has the spiral running in an opposite direction. So we have this crisscrossing effect that makes an enormously strong structure, especially when we then impregnate that whole thing with very hard, stiff hydroxyapatite crystals of the extracellular matrix, the ground substance. Very, very strong indeed. So here's, again, a picture I think we saw before of flat bones in which we have a plate of compact bone. It's not zoomed in enough to see the microscopic structure, but we can see a plate of flat bone on the inside and outside of this cranial bone or skull bone, and some compact, or some lamellar bone, some cancellous bone or trabecular bone or spongy bone in between the diploa. So that's what spongy bone is like. It's got lots of little bridges of bone with lots of spaces where the red bone marrow resides. When we talk about the extracellular matrix of bone, we have collagen fibers. Bone is made largely of collagen. It's the most prevalent building stuff of your body. It's a protein. It's actually a family of a whole bunch of different types of collagen. But anyway, it's a protein called collagen. And then we slather that with some very dense or some very stiff, hard mineral material, the hydroxyapatite. The collagen is called the organic component because organic compounds, proteins are organic compounds that can contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, occasionally some nitrogens, and some phosphorus, and possibly some sulfur. All those elements make up organic compounds. So the organic material refers to the collagen, and it's what gives resilience, flexibility to bones. We think of bones as being rigid, but they're not actually rigid. They have some resilience, and that comes from the organic component. And the hydroxyapatite, the mineral part, is called the inorganic component, and it adds the stiffness to bone. But we don't want it too stiff. We don't want it brittle. If the osteocytes, as you age, stop that turnover and replacement process, as we'll see later, the bone's going to get brittle and become easily broken. Okay, so let's do an exercise next in bone development. We'll talk about how do long bones and flat bones arise during embryonic or fetal development, and then how does that process continue during infancy and childhood. So that'll be our next topic. We'll end the first part of this chapter right here, and we'll come back for part 2 and talk about the way long bones and flat bones form in the body.